In a busy neighborhood on the edge of Lagos, Nigeria, where small roadside stalls stood along the dusty streets and the air smelled of roasted corn and spicy suya, lived a young woman named Grace. She was the youngest daughter of her parents, a quiet father who worked as a teacher in a public school, and a cheerful mother who sold vegetables in the local market. Grace grew up hearing the crackle of the small radio early in the morning and the constant sound of city buses in the evening. Even with the endless rush of city life, she held on to a strong dream of finding the perfect marriage. From as long as she could remember, Grace often thought about the wedding ceremonies at her church, the Salvation Assembly. Whenever a wedding was announced, she watched with childlike wonder as the bridal party entered the church. She admired the shining gowns, the bright head ties of the guests, and the serious voice of the pastor as he blessed the couples. The couples in her church seemed so perfect. The groom bold in his suit, the bride glowing as if an angel touched her. The pastor's words echoed in her ears. When you find a spouse within the church, you find God's perfect will. Like many young women around her, Grace fully believed this. In many parts of Africa, especially in some Christian groups, marriage is not just about two people, but also a spiritual agreement that affects the entire community. Older relatives gather to pray, mothers are happy the family line will continue, and young people watch and hope for their own turn. Grace's imagination soared when she thought of these ceremonies. At night in her small, neat room, she would look at the church's wedding album, a big leather-bound book usually kept in the pastor's office, but sometimes shown during youth meetings. It had glossy photos of many weddings, each one grander than the last. She marveled at the fancy cakes, the detailed bouquets, and the joy shining on every couple's face. All Grace wanted was that same happiness. Now, she believed that if she followed the church's guidance, staying humble, praying regularly, and marrying a church boy, she would surely have a joyful marriage. She reminded herself that the pastor said, "God blesses those who obey him." Grace's life changed one hot Saturday afternoon when the church youth group held a small prayer vigil in the open courtyard behind the main church building. Plastic chairs were set up in circles, lanterns glowed as daylight faded, and young people, boys and girls in their late teens or early 20s, chatted happily as they prepared for the evening of worship. Around 7 o'clock, the prayer leader asked for someone to lead the opening prayer. A tall, gentle young man named Kenneth stepped forward. He wore a neatly ironed shirt and pants that made him look mature. As soon as he began to pray, his soft voice carried a calm authority that made everyone else stop talking. Grace peeked at him from under her scarf, drawn to the gentleness in his voice and the confident way he stood. Long after the vigil ended, Grace couldn't forget his prayer. She realized she had never really noticed him before. He attended church regularly but stayed in the background. She heard he was part of the church choir, sometimes seen helping the music director after service by arranging microphones and instruments. But there was something special about his calmness that night. In a place where many prayed loudly and passionately, Kenneth's quiet strength felt like a soft whisper in a noisy crowd. In the weeks that followed, Grace saw Kenneth more often. Sometimes during Sunday service, he sat in the row behind hers. After the final prayer, she would see him politely helping older church members, carrying their bags or finding them a ride if they needed it. Each time she saw him, a warm feeling bloomed in Grace's heart. She believed it was a sign from God, pointing her toward a man who fit perfectly with her faith. Sometimes she would be talking to friends when she noticed Kenneth from the corner of her eye. He often stood with his hands folded behind his back, looking around as if quietly understanding everything around him. One Thursday evening, after Bible study, Grace was about to leave when Kenneth came up to her for the first time. "Good evening, Sister Grace," he said, lowering his gaze a bit to show respect. "I hope you don't mind if I walk you to the bus stop." Grace's heart beat faster, but she tried to act calm. "I don't mind at all," she answered. They walked together along the lit path leading to the main road. The busy sounds of Lagos, Nigeria traffic came from beyond the church gates, and a warm breeze carried the smell of freshly fried akara from a stall nearby. They talked about the Bible study lesson on love and compassion. Kenneth said he was moved by the teaching about serving others, and Grace nodded with excitement, adding her own thoughts. By the time they reached the bus stop, They had talked for almost 30 minutes, though it felt like only a few seconds. In a city as large and fast-paced as Lagos, Nigeria, moments like this are rare, especially among church youths who have many responsibilities. For Grace, it felt like destiny. When she got on her bus home, she put her hands together and whispered a thank you prayer. She believed something important had just begun. Within a month of that night, Kenneth and Grace started spending more time together. They weren't exactly dating in the modern sense, no romantic dinners or movie dates. Their time together mostly happened at church events. They sat next to each other during Sunday services, sometimes ate together at the after-service love feast, and talked on the phone during the week, mostly to check on each other. Still, everyone around them could tell they were heading toward marriage. In many African churches, if a man visits a woman's family and they spend time together in church, the next step is often a formal announcement or even an engagement. So it wasn't shocking when Kenneth asked if he could visit Grace's parents. Grace was thrilled because she saw this as a clear sign of his serious intentions. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Along, welcomed Kenneth with open arms. Her mother served him jollof rice, stewed chicken, and fried plantains, while her father asked him a few polite questions about his job and family. Kenneth answered politely, smiling but keeping some details vague. He said he worked with a relative in a small import business, but didn't say much more. In truth, Grace's parents were just happy to see their daughter happy, so they did not push for more information. But there were small clues. Kenneth sometimes seemed guarded, and he avoided personal questions. Grace, full of hope, ignored these signs. In her mind, she was already imagining their wedding day, with the church choir singing, the pastor in his white robe, and her father proudly walking her down the aisle. She convinced herself that all men keep some parts of their lives private. After 6 months, Kenneth proposed. It wasn't a big show. He simply held her hand one Sunday after church, led her to a quiet spot in the church garden and said, "Grace, I believe God brought us together. Will you marry me so we can serve him together as one?" Tears filled her eyes. She could feel the honesty in his voice. She said yes without a second thought, sure she was stepping onto the road of her biggest blessing. In many Nigerian communities, wedding preparations begin with lots of excitement. Family members are told, introductions happen, and a date is picked. In Grace's church, word of her engagement spread faster than gossip at the local market. The youth choir squealed with joy. Older women patted Grace's shoulder and offered to help cook or decorate. At first, Kenneth seemed happy to let Grace handle most of the planning. She called her older cousins, some had planned their own big weddings, to talk about caterers, photographers, and colors for decorations. Grace wanted everything to be perfect. Maybe perfection was impossible, but she believed their wedding, blessed by God and prayed over by the church, could be the exception. But as the wedding day got closer, cracks began to show. Kenneth grew distant. At first, he just brushed aside her questions about colors or caterers. "I'm busy," he said. "You know my schedule is tight." Grace tried to understand, telling herself he would relax once the wedding was over. However, more worrying signs appeared. Kenneth spoke harshly about some church members, calling them fake. Grace tried to laugh it off, blaming wedding stress, but inside she felt a little uneasy. Was this the same calm Kenneth who led that powerful prayer vigil? He now seemed angry and bitter. Her best friend Shinor noticed Grace's worries. One day, at the tailor's shop where they were fitting bridesmaid dresses, she quietly asked, "Grace, are you sure you're okay? Is everything fine with Kenneth?" Grace forced a smile. "Yes, we're fine. He's just stressed. You know how this city is. Work, wedding plans, church events. It's a lot," Shinor nodded, though she didn't seem fully convinced. In Nigerian church culture, even good friends hesitate to dig too deep because marriage is seen as holy, and questioning it can be viewed as meddling in God's plan. The wedding day itself was a swirl of bright colors, music, and heartfelt vows. The church was packed. Friends, relatives, and well-wishers wore beautiful anchor prints and gel head wraps that rose like crowns. The choir sang popular worship songs, and the pastor preached about the sacredness of marriage. When Grace walked down the aisle, Her heart pounded so hard she barely heard the cheerful singing of the congregation. Yet one thing stuck in her mind: Kenneth's face. Though he wore a slight smile, there was a distance in his eyes. In almost all the photos taken by the roaming cameraman, that shadow remained. Still, the ceremony was lovely. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife, urging them to build their home on faith, respect, and deep love. Outside in the church courtyard, people danced and celebrated, sharing good wishes. The smell of jollof rice and fried chicken filled the air. Local drinks like Zobo and Chapman were served in plastic cups. An older woman from the church told Grace, "My daughter, you have done well. May God bless your union and give you many children." Grace thanked her, hugging the older woman while feeling a slight pain in her chest. She looked around for Kenneth, who was talking to one of the church elders. For a moment, she wondered if she truly knew the man she had just vowed to love forever. During the first few weeks of marriage, there were some sweet moments. Kenneth praised her cooking, or they prayed together at night. But these moments were fewer than Grace had hoped. Often he was on his phone late at night or watching TV while she ate alone at the dining table, finishing her food in silence. One Sunday morning, Grace woke up early, hoping they would attend church together for their first Sunday as a married couple. She made a quick breakfast, laid out his clothes, and gently tried to wake him. He groaned, mumbled that he was too tired, and rolled over. After trying for half an hour, she gave up and went to church alone, making excuses to people who asked where her husband was. In the evenings, when she tried to talk to him about money, future plans, or how they could grow together spiritually, he would either dodge her questions or dismiss them. "Why do you worry so much?" he asked. "Just relax." Meanwhile, rumors reached Grace that he had been seen with another woman named Fumi. The whispers were quiet and hushed, but they still made her uneasy. She prayed a lot, reminding herself that if Kenneth had a past with someone, that was over now. They were married. "Marriage is honorable," she repeated to herself. "The bed is undefiled." But each day they drifted further apart. Many nights Grace shed quiet tears, asking herself questions she was too scared to say out loud. Could a brand new marriage already be falling apart? Had she been so excited about a perfect wedding that she didn't notice they needed a strong base of trust? She found a bit of comfort in her daily chores, cooking, cleaning, going to work. A few times she thought of asking an older woman at church for advice, but she was afraid of being judged. She didn't want to be the newlywed who was already complaining about her husband. "Just pray," she told herself. "He'll come around." But her prayers felt empty. Late at night, she remembered how excited she was when she looked at the church's wedding album. All those couples seemed flawless. Could they really be so happy? Or were they also struggling quietly, held back by tradition and others' expectations? The constant stress and emotional pain wore Grace down. She felt tired all the time, sometimes dizzy when she stood too quickly. At work, her coworkers noticed she was distracted. One even asked if she was pregnant. She just smiled weakly and hid her worries. After many tries to talk to Kenneth about her concerns, she decided to confide in her best friend, Chinor, once more. This time, Grace told her everything: the late nights, his lack of interest, and the rumors about another woman. Chinor listened, clearly worried. When Grace finished, Chinor sighed. "Marriage is not easy, Grace," Chinor said. "I'm not trying to ignore what you're going through. It's just that nobody really warns us how it really is until we're already in it. But remember, you can't fix this alone. If Kenneth won't open up or go to counseling, there's only so much you can do." Grace nodded, relieved to share her burden. "I keep hoping," she said quietly, "hoping he'll change, that he'll realize how much I love him and want this to work." Chinor held Grace's hand. "Hope is good, prayer is good, but you also need truth and action. God guides us, but he also gave us minds and senses for a reason. Don't lose yourself trying to hold on to a dream if it's hurting you." So the seeds of Grace's dream, first planted when she looked through the church's wedding album, started to show signs of sickness. She felt a deep gap growing in her marriage, but she did not yet see how much hurt and deceit lay behind Kenneth's calm surface. Like many African stories, this one began with hope, tradition, and the backing of the community. But underneath the bright cloth of celebration, there were hidden threads of conflict and sadness. Would Grace find the strength to face the dark parts of her marriage? Or would she hold on to the polished surface out of fear of gossip and shame? As the saying goes, a man who hides behind the shadow of a tree must be prepared to face the darkness when the sun goes down. The sun was setting fast and night was coming, with truths Grace never expected.